Here at Cambridge, I'm about to start a PhD in history, and what I'm going to be looking at is the ways that the reform organizations I was looking at in my prior research at Yale actually shaped the ways that people related to their gender identities and the things that they want. So before coming to Cambridge, I was at Yale studying the theory and history of architecture, and there I was doing a research master's on reform organizations that use the built environment to change the behaviors of citizens in the early 20th century. Specifically, I was looking at an organization called the Better Homes in America campaign that sort of redefined home and family life in gendered and sexual ways. So one of the links that I'm going to talk about in my upcoming dissertation is the role that social reform took in the 1920s, the shifts that occurred. And this, I think, has been really aided by my studies in architecture because I was able to look at the ways that social reform relied on space. So there's a whole shift to what was called an environmentalist approach to social reform, which was seen as contrasting with a sort of top-down repressive form of social reform. So the environmentalist approach to social reform sought to actually change the built environment such that it would act upon subjects and make them want different things or behave differently just by virtue of the environment in which they lived in. And so what you had was this American Social Hygiene Association and the Better Homes in America campaign actually trying to compel people to live in families, to engage in monogamous couples, to relate to their genders and the opposite gender in heteronormative ways, not because it was the moralistically right thing to do, but because it was made desirable. And you see these campaigns that actually prefigure early advertising campaigns, basically suggesting that this is an enjoyable and desirable way to live. What I've been doing at Cambridge after doing that research is looking at ways in which people have deviated from these norms. So if there are all these organizations deciding what everyday life would look like in America in the 20th century, there were also organizations that were living in communes, especially in the 1960s and 1970s. People living in communes, people creating their own sort of institutions, their own sort of versions of norms and everyday life, their own instances of common sense. And so here at Cambridge, what I've been doing is specifically looking at communes and the ways that they have shaped their own norms, especially looking at an organization called the Gay Liberation Front, which was behind a lot of sort of communal living projects, both in the United States and in England, and the specific ways in which they played with subjectivity, power, wealth, economy. What I'm finding is that there's a real difficulty in those communes struggling with sort of gender and identity around sexuality, and so and specifically producing new norms around those things. So what I'm looking at now is a number of other reform organizations returning to the 1920s who put in place a series of reforms and standardizations around how people should relate to their own sexual identities and other people's sexual identities and their gendered identities. Clearly, this is a pressing issue today, but with all sorts of gendered antagonism occurring, we have the Me Too movement happening. So in my view, this research is quite relevant, investigating how we came to have the narratives that we have around gender and sexuality. One of the sort of persistent ideas that we see playing out in the counterculture of the 60s that I think is still with us today is a narrative around male vice and female virtue, the idea that men are generally sort of weak and beholden to their desires, and this is just what you can expect from men, and that women are inherently pure and better behaved and actually a source of a sort of virtuous insight. What I'm finding is that there were a lot of moves, especially by an organization called the American Social Hygiene Association, to really cement this particular narrative in place. That organization was a descendant of an organization called the American Social Purity Alliance. So there's this whole purity discourse that emerges around this. That gets sort of medicalized in the early 20th century by organizations like the American Social Hygiene Association. And you see a bunch of reform organizations change their names from sort of moralizing to scientific terminologies and embrace scientific discourses. And so the Social Hygiene Association was one such organization.